Materials provided by Tombow and Winsor Newton.
The place we went where I felt like I really understood scale was at Goblin Valley. Goblin Valley is the most bizarre place. First of all, when we went, it was totally deserted. I think the whole time we were there for 2 days, I saw maybe 6 other adults and 2 park rangers. Goblin Valley is a really remote location. I mean, we were in the middle of nowhere, and then we drove from there to another middle of nowhere. And I asked my husband, Alex, like, this place is amazing. Like, why is this not more popular? And he said he really thinks because the location is just so remote that a lot of people just don't make the effort to get out there. And so, because there were so few people there, there is this stillness and quiet that I don't think I've seen anywhere else on this planet before. I have to say, though, if you're 2 kids visiting Goblin Valley, that is like the world's greatest hide and seek location. I mean, they actually said to me when they were playing hide and seek that they agreed that they would just play hide and seek around this one cluster because I guess hide and seek is actually too hard at Goblin Valley because it's so gigantic and you're trying to find each other and it's too difficult. So I thought that was very funny that they actually laid out ground rules for where they could actually play hide and seek. After doing that landscape painting that was in Winslow, I started to realize that really the theme with watercolor, what it really comes down to is control. I think about it almost like it's a slippery fish out of water that I'm trying so hard to grab it, but the more that I try to grab at it, the worse things get. I tried to think really deliberately about, okay, when am I really going to try to exert a lot of control over the watercolor? And what are some times when I'm really going to just let the watercolor run wild, giving myself really specific spaces to exert control, to get rid of control, really helped organize my thoughts a lot better. Because I do think a lot of people think about watercolor as this very blobby, very mushy, flowy type of material. But the thing is, it can't always be that way. You always need to have some feeling of structure that really is holding everything up. The marker is really what became that structure for my watercolor paintings. For this landscape that I did at Goblin Valley, I really thought about the marker and the watercolor being like this multi-layered cake where they would layer on top of each other and I could fluctuate between exerting a lot of control and having structure to the painting, but also letting myself go nuts and completely relinquish any feeling of control. Starting with the marker was really helpful because the marker is a material that I'm very comfortable with. It feels very stable to me. And so I was able to use the marker to really map out the entire composition, get all the forms really well established with very light, neutral color. That let me get in there with a very big brush, a brush that was big enough that it felt uncomfortable at the time. But the thing that's really nice about big brushes is that that skeletal structure that I had mapped out with the markers was so helpful because I felt very confident that I could get a little bit crazier with my big brush strokes. I could twist the brush, I could turn it, I could bend it in all types of different directions. And yet, no matter what happened, that marker structure was always there to back me up. I used the watercolor layer really to just spread myself out, to fill in all of the forms and colors. Then I brought the marker back. And what the marker really helped me a lot with was, first of all, establishing a better sense of contrast. Because I do think with watercolor, it is hard to put down something that really is dark. If you have a piece of charcoal, it's really easy to just lay down a very black mark. But with watercolor, it's not usually like that because usually the colors have water mixed into them, which inevitably makes the color a lot lighter. The marker was really great because it felt like this very stabilizing presence as I blocked in the darker passages of purple. I felt like I was reinforcing some of the structure that inevitably came apart when I started putting the watercolor on top. At Goblin Valley, when you approach the valley, you have to walk downwards towards all of the different goblins. And my kids, I have never seen them run that fast on a hill before because they just were so eager to get down into that space. I was surprised at Goblin Valley that I actually wanted to draw the entire landscape. And that was really the only site we visited where I had that urge, maybe because it's just such a bizarre space. It's so surrealistic. It was actually featured in that silly movie. It was a Star Trek parody called Galaxy Quest, where they go visit this alien planet, which is actually Goblin Valley. And I bet you anything, the people who are watching that movie who didn't know Goblin Valley probably thought it was some computer generated landscape when actually it was just the actors running around that space. What I absolutely love about the combination of these alcohol-based markers and the watercolor is that the marker really sinks right into the watercolor. I mean, they could not be better paired. And in fact, they pair so well that later on, you almost can't tell which one is marker and which one is watercolor. I mean, they really blend beautifully. And it's incredible. You really can see the tone of the orange coming through the periwinkle layer of marker that's on top. They're really very effective together. I don't know that landscape painting has to be about matching colors in a really accurate manner. I think what really helped me with color is when I stopped trying to match colors accurately, I felt like I could really harness the colors a lot better. So much of color has to do with what you choose to see. For example, if you choose to see only gray in that landscape, that's all you're ever going to see. But you really can train your eye to see other colors. You can say, is that gray pointing a little bit more towards purple or a little bit more towards blue? Which one would that be? And so it's not so much that I'm imposing new colors there, as much as I am seeing the colors that are there and trying to boost them more. Because if I take them so literally, that's when your downward spiral towards muddy colors just keeps going. A lot of people ask me why I oftentimes paint shadows purple, because I think it's pretty easy to look at this landscape and say, oh, that's gray, I'm going to paint it gray. Watercolor is prone to getting muddy anyway. And so if you start with gray as shadows, you're just in big trouble at that point. It is easier to put down a color that's too bright and then make it more muted than to start with a very muted color and then try to make it brighter. So I would actually, with watercolor, prefer for my colors to be too brilliant and then knock them down later than to really try to nail that muted color the first time through. The risk of the painting getting muddy is just so high anytime you use gray for those shadows. The range of textures that you find at Goblin Valley are simply extraordinary. There are the goblins, as they're called, which are these monumental rocks that are incredibly rigid and powerful. But then there were also passages in the ground that were really soft and mushy. I really felt like I was walking on top of tofu, that the ground would sink every single time I took a step. There were surfaces you could touch that really looked just like unfired terracotta clay, where if you touch the surface, little bits would just flake off. They were really brittle. And there were some sections that really just looked like crumbs from a cookie. Goblin Valley is such a tactile place. You really just want to touch everything. And not just because it's fun, but because sometimes the textures were really deceptive. There were some sections you would look at it and think, oh, that's probably very rigid. But then you would touch it and it would sink underneath your hand like a pillow. There were parts of the ground where you could see trails of water that had eroded the surface of the valley. And it was just beautiful because you felt like you were watching these traces of the history of the valley. I was surprised staying in southern Utah on a longer term basis, the way that the landscapes really changed their personality depending on the weather, the time of day, the season. It's really phenomenal, the range of personalities that you see. When we first arrived at Goblin Valley, it was the middle of the day, bright, glaring, direct sunlight, no clouds visible in the sky anywhere. And the goblins in the valley, they were so crisp and articulate, and the forms really popped onto the surface like they were leaping out at you. It actually was unbearably hot the first time that we came to the valley that we actually decided later on, you know what, I think we need to go in the morning because we're just going to burn to a crisp if we come again in the afternoon. And so the next morning we got up really early and it was wonderful. It was nice, cool, refreshing air. We could walk without sweat dripping down our backs. And it really felt like a different place. It was foggy. The colors were a lot more subtle and closer in value. The goblin forms, they felt like they were almost sinking into the landscape. They felt less aggressive. And there was almost this misty haze that came across the sky that was so beautiful and elegant. And it was such a different feeling from the daytime when the goblins really felt like these very gargantuan, bulbous forms. Now they felt very subtle by comparison. Later on, we went to the visitor center, which was fun because we got to read about Goblin Valley and how it came to be. And apparently, the valley is made out of sandstone. But the thing is, the sandstone is uneven. So there are some parts of the sandstone that are really soft and other areas that are very stiff. And so there are some parts of the sandstone that really resist the erosion. But then there are other parts that are really soft and they're really easily eroded by wind and water. And so, in that sense, that's the reason why the goblins are sculpted by the wind and the water. And that's how you get these mushroom like forms. I sat above the valley so that I could get a greater view of the entire landscape. And I was so excited to draw these forms because they're so weird and lumpy and mushroom like. And it's just the coolest landscape. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. And I remember when I was drawing there were these two guys that came by who were so stoned. And they were just like the classic stereotypical guys out of that movie, Dazed and Confused. And they were like, yeah, man, I don't like it when my mom like calls me. Yeah, dude, let's go over there and let's hang out. I got my music. And so this is like the backdrop of what I'm painting this piece to. And I just watched them wander around the valley. And that was sort of entertaining while I was doing my painting. Later, when I came back and I looked at that painting, again, I was so mad at myself. I mean, let's just preface this with saying I was pretty much mad at myself after every single piece I did on this trip because trying to learn something new, you tend to get that type of mindset. But what bothered me so much about that watercolor landscape at Goblin Valley is that I looked at that painting and I thought, these look like pebbles. There's no sense of scale at all. Like anybody looking at this painting would probably think I was just painting about 30 pebbles that were sitting on the ground. And you had no idea the way a person would interact with that landscape. And I thought to myself later, oh, maybe those two stoner guys, maybe they did have a purpose. I should put them into the landscape and then we'll really understand what the scale is like. I mean, of course, at that point, it was too late to fake it with that particular painting. But I remember after that experience, I totally changed my approach to the painting and even shooting this video. I thought to myself, wow, it really doesn't matter if you're going to experience these incredible slot canyons, but not understand how a human actually interacts with that scale. And I vowed from that point on, I got to include the people, I got to show the scale, I got to see how these people are part of that landscape and what their interaction is. I've seen plenty of photographs of these landscapes before coming here. For example, there's always those like corny calendars that you get at the bookstore. There's also photographers like Ansel Adams, and yet nothing really prepares you for how you as a human relate to the scale of these landscapes. You'd think it was just that the scale was so big. I mean, yeah, that's part of it. But actually, I found the scale in these landscapes just really confusing. We would drive by a giant mountain and my kids would point out some shape on top of the mountain. And there was this one shape they saw, they said, that looks like a tortilla chip. And my husband said to them, well, you know what? That's probably like 100-foot tall tortilla chip you're talking about. And they were so confused. They're like, how do you know how big it is? And he said, well, if you look at the truck that's underneath that mountain, you have to make that comparison to have any sense of how big it was. And so scale, I think, was very, very difficult to convey to people, even when they were actually seeing the landscape right in front of them. To me, the self-critique process starts out by observing what I'm doing with every single painting. Before I started a new piece, I would say to myself, okay, what did I do last time? And now what do I want to do differently with this new painting? When I finish a painting, I then ask myself, okay, well, what worked out really well this time and what didn't work out so well? I write down all those self-critique notes in my sketchbook, and then I make a plan for what is my strategy for the next painting that I want to do. I remember afterwards being so mortified by the results. I looked at that painting and I thought to myself, oh my God, there are so many blacks in this piece. It's so totally overdone. The strategy that I took from that experience was that the next piece that I worked on, I would not put in the blacks so early in my process, and I would wait until almost the end of the painting to put in those blacks at the very end. Every now and then, take out all the pieces that I'd been doing, and I would compare them as an arc of progress. Sometimes you look at these paintings that you did at the very beginning of the trip, you almost don't recognize them. You're like, whoa, that was my painting from a week ago? And you surprise yourself by the kind of progress that you make. I don't do that all the time because I think if you do that every single day, it's a little bit too much. But I do really enjoy the process of comparing all of the paintings and saying, well, look at what changed, look at what didn't. Here's something that was a surprise. It's really wonderful to have that experience looking at your work. My father-in-law is really good at fishing, and he wanted to take my two kids fishing for the first time. We went to Pine Lake, which had this just perfect, gorgeous, picturesque scene, all these gigantic rocks, beautiful flowing water. First thing I thought, this is quintessential Winslow Homer. And I said, okay, this is it. I'm going to channel Winslow Homer. I don't recommend doing that because that just totally destroyed everything for me. I just totally froze up. My daughter was even wearing this like hot pink shirt. And I remember looking at it and thinking, oh my God, that pink just leaps off of the gray neutrals. But then I started thinking about Winslow Homer and I felt like crap. I was like, oh my God, I suck. After that day, I was like, you know what? Sergeant, Winslow Homer, I love you guys, but you're not helping me right now. So I actually put all their stuff away. I'm not trying to say that you should not look at art history because I think everybody should. I just think sometimes there's a time and a place for it. One of the best parts about visiting a site in person is getting to see how people interact with the landscape. And even more than that, how differently kids interact with the landscape than an adult. We visited the coral pink sand dunes one day. My kids, they were like digging their hands into the sand. They were pouring it all over themselves. One of them was digging a ditch, trying to get to the cooler section of the sand. My older daughter also started to make it a habit to create an on-site art piece in every area we visited. We were in the slot canyons, and she played with all the different colors of sand, getting red sand, putting white pebbles on top of it, placing a flower in the center. The landscape here, it's begging to be sculpted. My daughter discovered when we were camping in Moab that the sand there was fragile enough that you could definitely squish it with your hands very easily, but that if you held it just gently enough, you could just very gently carve the surface with your fingers. And she actually ended up sculpting this sand cat. She created a little village later on and she put little stones in there. It was really wonderful to see how she interacted with that landscape. When I was in elementary school, I really wanted to be an archaeologist. I loved this idea of going hunting for something, finding it, digging it out of the dirt. And that's why when my father in law took me and my two kids mushroom hunting, it was like the greatest realization of that dream. It was like everything that is fun about being an archaeologist, but without the history degree, and you got to eat what you found later on. I felt like I was on the world's coolest treasure hunt. I want everyone to know, though, that you should never go mushroom hunting unless you're going with somebody who is a seasoned expert, because there's so many poisonous mushrooms out there. And actually, the ones that are really pretty and colored bright red are the really poisonous, scary ones. And so I was actually very uptight with my kids. I kept saying, don't touch it. No, wait for your grandpa to get it first. And they thought I was crazy. But you read all these scary things about mushrooms killing people. And I thought, okay, let's just be a little bit on the safe side. My father-in-law was so knowledgeable about mushrooms, and he was giving them all these tips for how to find the right mushrooms, how to spot which ones were bad. He said one thing to look for in Utah, at least, is to not pick any ones that had gills underneath. And there was one particular species that he had us look for, which was edible and, oh my gosh, so yummy. Boletus edulis. And those mushrooms were gigantic, and they have this spongy interior instead of the gills. Here in Utah, when you hunt for mushrooms in the mountains, you can only do it 2 weeks out of the year. And so my father-in-law was just overjoyed to take his grandkids mushroom hunting. And we got so many mushrooms. I mean, I had no idea that you could actually fill a bag with so many big mushrooms that it was actually heavy. I mean, it was heavy enough that I had to carry the bag and my kids couldn't handle it. I felt like my father-in-law was giving us all these little clues and hints for our treasure hunt. He would tell us things like, okay, if we just find one mushroom, that is a signal that there are others nearby. And he was so specific about which spots would be good for mushroom hunting, because he comes here to this area quite a bit, and he would say to us, oh, well, this is where I went hunting for mushrooms with my other son, and we found so many here, and this area was a little bit more sparse. And so he had a really, really good sense of the geography of that space. After we found a mushroom that was indeed the right type, my father-in-law would take a pocket knife and he would just carve off the bottom of the mushroom to clear off all the dirt. But also he said that sometimes worms will actually get into the mushrooms. And so you can see little spots where the worms have come in. And those are areas that he says, okay, well, this one's not going to be as good because the worms have gotten into it. So we were trying to find mushrooms that didn't have any worms and that actually were a little bit on the smaller side, because he said that the mushrooms that are bigger have more of a tendency to have worms and other things in them. We definitely noticed that we all had different methods for finding the mushrooms. My kids were so good at it by the time we went a second time. They were spotting them left and right. I'm like, how are you guys seeing this? They were finding ones that were buried underneath all these branches. And we actually found one cluster of mushrooms that was so big that it actually had lifted a rock upwards. For some reason, I could never spot them when we were walking around in the woods, but I was really good at finding them as we were driving through the road. I think I found 4 or 5 when we were just driving by. I don't know, something about spotting that color as we drove around the road was very easy for me. I was actually really bummed out at first because after we went mushroom hunting, I realized what a wonderful subject that was. And yet you can't really mushroom hunt and paint at the same time. Those two things don't really match. And I was so sad because I was like, this is such a cool subject. I really wish I could translate this into a watercolor painting. And then I thought, oh, that's it. I don't have to paint when I'm actually hunting for mushrooms. I should just paint the mushrooms. That revelation actually came at just the right time, because by the time we went mushroom hunting for the second time, I had already been in Utah for 2 weeks and I had already done several watercolor paintings, and I was starting to feel very scatterbrained. When you start a new material, I think there's somewhat of a honeymoon phase that you just dive in and you play and you experiment and you try this and try that, and nothing feels bad yet. I was starting to getting to the point where the experimentation that I was doing with the material was starting to get really confusing and really chaotic. And I felt like I had no control over anything. And so I said to myself, okay, let's just step back for a little bit. I've been doing all of these longer term pieces in all these different places. Maybe I need to reel it back in and do something really simple and straightforward. Because when you work on site, there's so many extra factors you have to deal with. You have to deal with the wind. I remember when I was painting at the cemetery, there were like these flies that kept bothering me. Sometimes the light changes, people are moving. And I think usually if I'm drawing with a material that I'm very good at, like charcoal or colored pencils, those types of things don't bother me so much because I am so confident about my technique. But when you throw in a new material like watercolor, those external factors really start to bother you a lot. I needed to paint something that was going to be really stable, super predictable, and very straightforward. And that's when I thought, oh, if I do some still life studies of these mushrooms, that's exactly what I want. Still life really gets a bad reputation. I think people naturally assume when they hear the word still life that it's going to be a really boring experience. But it doesn't have to be. And if you get to paint mushrooms that you hunted yourself, that's pretty cool. For me, still life played such an important role in terms of learning how to oil paint because my technique was such a disaster in art school. And still life was the one subject that really got me to calm down and to focus on those formal elements. And that's basically what happened here is I just gave myself one day. I sat down, I put out all the mushrooms we'd picked on the table, and I just painted mushrooms all day from the morning into the evening. I knew I wanted to do lots and lots of sketches. I also intentionally worked in my sketchbook because I think when I am working on the watercolor block, I do have an expectation that I am going to go in and do a completely realized painting. So that context of the sketchbook was very important. And also doing so many of them made it so that I never invested that much into each individual sketch because I knew, oh, well, if this sketch doesn't turn out well, I'll just go and paint another one.
Unlike the Winslow landscape painting, where I basically just winged it, I really decided with these mushroom sketches that I was going to have a really specific plan about what degrees of control I was going to be exerting at different stages of the painting. I wanted to start out the painting with a really dry, thin brush so I could really take my time, observe very carefully the essential structures of the mushroom, look for little character flaws in the form. And really, this is a stage where I wasn't so much painting as much as I was really drawing. I just happened to be doing it with a brush. And this was a stage where I was exerting serious control over the brush. I really was telling the brush exactly what to do, was not giving it any room to have a mind of its own. I find that even the way you physically hold your brush and grip it is so influential in terms of how much control you can get. For example, the beginning part of these mushroom sketches, I really was holding my brush a lot more like a pencil, as if I was writing something. And that gives me just so much control over the behavior of the brush. Whereas if I want the brush to have a lot more freedom and flexibility, oftentimes I will not grip it like a pencil. Instead, I'll hold it at the end, and that is much tougher to control. But it also allows for a lot more opportunity for spontaneity.
I know that a lot of people like to use pencil in the beginning of a watercolor painting, but I don't really like using the pencil sketch because my problem with the pencil line is oftentimes, especially if you're doing really, really light, subtle washes, you can almost always see the pencil underneath the watercolor. If you do end up using pencil, do the pencil sketch first, then take a white plastic eraser and just do a quick pass of eraser over the pencil lines so they're as minimal as possible. Gets me in the mindset of the watercolor. For me, there's such a big leap from the pencil into the watercolor because when I'm sketching with pencil, I'm in a totally different place in terms of my thinking. And then all of a sudden, I got to totally switch gears and start thinking about watercolor. But if I start with watercolor from the get-go, I'm already in that frame of mind from beginning to end. And I just find that not having to make that transition is much smoother for me. One of the most challenging things of watercolor is how to effectively use the white of the page. Sure, you can cheat and you can get white gouache and paint the white gouache on top of your painting if you want. I'm not really a big fan of that. I'd rather just stick with the watercolor and work with that. But the white of the page can be such a powerful part of your range of values. One of the first things that I think about is where do I want to preserve the white of the page? Because you can always go over it. If you decide later you don't want that white of the page, it's so easy to get rid of. But if you don't think about that in advance, it's so easy for that white of the page to completely get away from you.
I limited myself to about 15 or 20 minutes per mushroom sketch because having learned my lesson the hard way when I painted that landscape painting at Winslow, I was really conscious of overworking these paintings. Being conscious of that time frame was super helpful because it gave me reason to step away. I think all of us struggle with how to figure out, okay, when do I step away? Because you don't want to do it too soon and have your painting look unfinished. On the other hand, you don't want to get to a point where you've overlabored the painting to the point that it has this very tired, fussy look to it. Knowing that I was going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes per mushroom sketch gave me a really good structure, a compelling reason to step away, even when part of me really just wanted to go back and fuss over the tiny details. I really have to credit Andrew Wyeth for my discovery of how to use dry brushing in watercolor. I'd stumbled upon this Andrew Wyeth painting that was all these plants with a body of water and an island in the distance. But what struck me was how crunchy and how crisp a lot of those plants appeared in the foreground. Most of us think about a watercolor painting as being very flowy, very smooth, very light. And yet here was a painting that was not like that at all. The plants had this grit and texture to them that felt so concrete. And I knew I really wanted to harness something similar to that in my work. I know a common technique that a lot of people use with watercolor is wet into wet. But I'll tell you, that was not my cup of tea. I don't know, maybe I'm just like too big of a control freak to be into that. But I just found that it was just utter chaos. And so for me, I really relied on that dry brushing to retain some degree of control. Really, what the dry brushing became in the beginning of the painting was that skeletal structure that I had previously used my markers for when I was doing that Goblin Valley landscape painting. And that was very exciting because I felt like with these mushroom sketches, I really had worked the markers out of my system. I didn't feel that I needed to rely on them any more the way I did before. I think these mushroom sketches really were a pivotal moment in that I felt that I was removing the markers from the process. And in doing so, it was like taking the training wheels off your bike. Because I really was feeling with the mushroom sketches that if I had added marker into it, I really feel like it would have ruined the painting. And that's really, if you think about it, what training wheels do. Like at a certain point, they get in the way much more than they help you. And that's really what happened here with the markers in the watercolor is I let go of those markers and I just realized I don't need these anymore. That really slow, careful sketching that I did at the beginning with the dry brushing, I think really paid off because I went into the next stage with the big brush, blocking in large areas of color with a lot of confidence. I really felt that there was a structure holding me up and I could fill that space without any worry with the big brush. And what I did find is that my pace really slowed down a lot. I was painting with a big brush, but I was painting much slower and a lot more deliberately, almost like every single mark I put down with a big brush carried so much more weight and importance than it did before.
My drawing pace is usually incredibly fast. In fact, I've had people ask me if some of the video of my gesture drawings were sped up. I'm like, no, actually, those are real time. So I draw at a really spastic pace. And I discovered later on that I was trying to apply that exact same drawing pace to watercolor, and it was not happening. It was just making me really upset. And so when I did the mushroom sketches, I was working at the cabin, I had lots of space, I really took my time, and I was very mindful of doing less strokes. And I think slowing down helped that a lot because sometimes if you're working at such a frantic pace, you don't feel that there's any room to stop and really think about what you're doing. But really having this slowness and thoughtfulness as I did the mushroom sketches, I found was very, very helpful.
I was also able to really use the rough texture of the watercolor paper to my advantage. I felt like I could twist and turn and move those sumi brushes really across the surface in a way that felt really confident and strong. And I'd never felt that way about watercolor before. It was a wonderful moment. I think so much of the watercolor painting process is deeply embedded in your brush technique. I was trying really hard to think of the many different ways that I could physically hold and press my brush against the surface of the watercolor paper. For a lot of people, if you were to give them a brush and some watercolor, usually their first impulse is to take the brush and paint a downward stroke. But the thing is, you can't stick with that all the time. And so when I was using, especially the bigger brushes, I was really trying to avoid that typical downward stroke because too much of that can lead to your painting looking monotonous, that all the articulation feels too similar. Especially with the big brush, a lot of the time I wasn't even making a stroke as much as I was just taking the shape of the brush and just pressing it against the surface, almost like it was a rubber stamp. And then other times what I would do is put the brush down, but then I would have the brush tumble across the page, almost like the brush was doing a somersault across the surface of the paper. I make a pretty conscious effort to paint in different directions. So instead of that typical downward stroke, sometimes I would put the brush down, push it upwards, make it go diagonally. And so every single variation that you do with your brushwork, it's a different language, a different feeling, because that variety, I think, is what makes a watercolor painting so exciting. I've definitely seen paintings where I just know everything was painted with one brush in the same direction. And so I think really mixing it up and making those strokes as diverse as possible is hugely helpful. I think what's hard about doing these less typical brush strokes is that they are really unpredictable, because if you have a stroke and you do that typical downward stroke, you usually know about how that's going to look. But if you let your brush just roll across the surface in this strange manner, you don't always know what's going to happen. But for me, that lack of predictability keeps it fun, keeps it exciting, so that every time I put down a brushstroke, I really am reacting to the previous one. And it doesn't become this mechanical process that you're just repeating over and over again.
I really enjoyed the dry brushing with the mushroom paintings because I feel like the dry brush marks, it's like they have more bite. Sometimes the wet brush strokes, they feel so mushy and so slippery, and I don't really know what to do with them. And the dry brush, it's so concrete and so easy to control that it was very reassuring to work with that technique as I did these mushroom sketches. Dry brush strokes also are very handy because you can push them in a very specific direction. If you have a very wet brush and you just puddle a big area of watercolor, it's not going in a specific direction, whereas a dry brush, I can make it go upwards, to the side, or downwards, and I really like being able to have real control over the direction of the stroke.
I think another reason I enjoyed painting the mushrooms so much is that they're such sculptural, bulbous forms. And even though I really don't think about myself as a sculptor, I really do think about things in a sculptural way. And so a big part of this experience was, okay, well, how do I really get these forms in the mushroom to really bulge and to show their texture and to really get that form to pop? I just loved the shape of the mushrooms. First of all, they were gigantic. They were the biggest mushrooms I'd ever seen in my life. And the forms were so bulbous and organic. The feeling of the surface was so fleshy, and every mushroom really had its own personality with character flaws. I felt like a lot of them had warts and were a little ugly, but that's exactly why I loved them so much. The sculptor part of my brain likes to analyze what direction the form is going in. For example, maybe in the stem, the form is moving downwards. Maybe underneath the cap of the mushroom, things are tucking themselves underneath the cap of the mushroom. And so I analyze that. When I look at the mushrooms, I say, what direction is the form going in? And then I try to get my brushstroke to match that direction. And that helps me think about things more in terms of form and gets me to really think about shaping the mushrooms in a way that I think ends up feeling a lot more volumetric. It also helped that the mushrooms were pretty limited in terms of colors. Mostly it was warm colors like bright reds and yellows and burnt sienna colors, but I did definitely make an effort to sneak in just a few lighter periwinkle cool colors to balance it out. And for the first time during this trip, I really felt confident about laying down big, bright, saturated swaths of cadmium red, which was exciting because I'm in general quite afraid of color, especially bright ones. And it was exciting to really find a place where that felt right.
One really important discovery that I made is that I hadn't had any problems up until that point getting the watercolor and the Tombow brush pens to really blend well. But in this mushroom sketch, I really did. I discovered that if you have many, many layers of the Tombow brush pens, you end up with a surface that's actually pretty sleek. And when I went to put the watercolor over those many layers of the brush pens, the markers actually did resist the watercolors a little bit. Not a huge amount, but it was enough that I could not get the crispness of watercolor strokes that I was able to get before. And that was a really important technical realization for me to make in terms of how to get my media to work together. Because then I realized, okay, well, really, I have to not do so much marker work in the beginning, and that the marker work really should be in the latter part of the stages, because I could do all the watercolor in the world and the Tombow brush pens will always go over that. That's never a problem. But if I do 80% brush pen first with many, many layers and I try to put watercolor on top of that, it's not going to happen. And so that was a very important realization I made at that point. For comparison, after I finished all of the watercolor sketches of the mushrooms, I sat down and I did a mushroom drawing that was only with the Tombow brush pens. It felt really weird after spending all day using watercolor. It felt really mushy and blendy, and it just got really muddy really fast.
There's so many things that bothered me about it. First of all, the markers lacked the delicate quality of detail that I was able to get with the watercolor, because the brush pens, they do have a thin tip, but they're nowhere near as thin as you can get with the very thin Sumi brush. And so by comparison, the markers really felt klutzy. They felt too big. I felt like I couldn't get the degree of delicate detail that I was able to achieve when I was sketching the mushrooms with watercolor. The contrast was too low. I didn't feel like I could really put down a strong, bold, satisfying mark of black. And the colors ended up gross. Like, I look back at this drawing, I'm like, oh my gosh, my mushroom looks like a corpse. It looks horrible. And that was the moment where I thought, you know what? I don't need you anymore, alcohol-based markers. I am home free now. I don't need this. I can just think about watercolor completely on its own. That really was a moment, because up until that point, I didn't like anything that I did that was just in the watercolor, but this was really the first time where I realized, wow, the results I got with the watercolor, they were so much better than what I got when I was just using the markers.
I really like doing tons of sketches because there's something very meditative about doing the same act over and over again, but it's also really fun to see the learning curve that occurs even within the course of a single day. Because in the beginning, I know that I was not doing as much dry brushing, and so my paintings felt a little bit too soft. And then as I progressed, I started implementing more and more dry brushing, and it was so cool at the end of the day to just go through the sketchbook, flip through the pages, look at each individual sketch, look at what changed. And if you compare the very first mushroom sketch to the last one, there's a pretty visible difference. I really do consider the mushroom sketches as being a pivotal point in this process, because in the beginning, you're just trying out different things. And the mushroom sketches for me were a really nice, solid foundation that I established in the trip at a very critical point.